So I mean no disrespect to anyone. And I know there are some who will listen to this and you won't like what I'm about to say. Perhaps you will you will stop listening to me altogether. But before you do, let me just say I have no dog in the fight, okay? My team never made it. But if we hit rewind to February 2020, it's Super Bowl Sunday, right? The Kansas City Chiefs, they're getting ready to play the San Francisco 49ers. One is my dad's team and the other is my father-in-law's. And if you didn't watch the game, it was a good game, right? I mean, if you didn't see the highlights, it's a high energy, nail-biting, back and forth kind of game. Both teams, they felt evenly matched. They were neck and neck all throughout the game, but then came the third quarter, and it looked like the 49ers were getting ready to walk off with a win, right? They scored a field goal and a touchdown, giving them a 10-point lead with a measly 1 quarter left. In a game that's evenly matched, trading points back and forth, stopping big plays, how are you going to score enough points to tie the game, let alone pull off a win, especially when the clock is ticking? Well, that is when the unexpected happens. If you can remember, Patrick Mahomes, he led his team to score 21 points and brought home the victory for his team. I mean, it was a crazy game. There were people who were just celebrating like crazy, and I'm sure there are people who just hit mute on the TV. But, hang in there with me, right? I mean, there was me, like for me, I was excited, I was stunned that this unexpected turn of events took place. It was a fun game, but honestly, I was emotionally, I was neutral because it wasn't my team. But if we can learn anything from football this year and life today, it's this. It's that even while it looks like you were on the losing side and you are entering into the last quarter with insurmountable odds stacked against you, we're on the winning team. We are on the winning side of history. And in Daniel chapter 8, this is the kind of picture that we get. We get a picture of a powerful kingdom that does damage to God's people. And it looks like, if you look at the circumstances, you'd be tempted to think they're on the losing team. They're on the losing side of history. But Daniel chapter 8, it pulls back the veil and it tells us a different story altogether. It reminds us, as it did them, that appearances can be deceptive. Because even when it looks like you're losing, we are on the winning team. But before we dive into Daniel chapter 8, let me make a little confession. The latter part of the book of Daniel is labeled apocalyptic. And there's been a whole lot of ink spilled over trying to explain what it is, what its function is, what its history, what its meaning is all about. So what is it that makes a book like Daniel and Revelation so challenging is that they have many layers to them. To quote the Disney theologian Shrek, ogres are like onions, right? Okay. Apocalyptic texts, they're like onions. They have many layers to them. So let me give you 4 layers of apocalyptic text. First, they draw upon the whole of Scripture in their writings. They have incorporated in their writing much of the biblical story and its context. But rarely do they ever say, so-and-so said. Every once in a while, but rarely do they do that. And it's not exactly straightforward. It's a lot of times allusions. So it can get a little bit challenging for us to figure out where the allusion is and what exactly it's meant, what the allusion means. Second, they sometimes tell events symbolically, and sometimes they predict events symbolically. And a lot of times it's hard to tell if they're talking about the future or if they're talking about the present day when the readers are reading this. Third, it's clear that it reveals real events, but they're described with symbols. The goal is not for us to take those symbols literally and then try to figure out what they mean to us today. Like how do our modern inventions enlighten the text? That's not how we should approach it, right? Kind of like this flying chariot thing in the Bible, it must be the Apache helicopter. It's not, right? Don't do that. That's not the case. The goal is to help us see life apocalyptically, through the lens of an apocalypse. That is, when we see a selfish and oppressive nation rise up and kind of oppress God's people, we understand they're acting like a beast. And they are a corruption of God's original creation. Fourth layer is that these letters, they offer hope and encouragement in the face of believers in trying times. But it's not always clear what those trying times are. So here's my confession. A book like Daniel is just flat out hard to interpret. I feel personally like I'm a child stepping up to bat in the major leagues. Now, I don't know what that does to your confidence in me as a preacher, but it's honestly the truth. I mean, I love studying this, I love learning about this, and I love sharing with you what I am learning. But please know that I am just a human, and occasionally I'm going to miss a detail here and get a detail wrong there. But the beauty and the power of a passage like this is that for the most part, the big ideas and the big encouragement that we are drawing from the text, it's pretty clear. So, what is it that we learn from Daniel chapter 8? It's this. The God who knows the future runs the future. The God who knows the future runs the future. And contrary to what many people believe about the future is not favorable to the prideful. So let's jump into our passage in Daniel chapter 8, starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. So this is like 2 years after the dream that he had of those like gnarly beasts. You remember in chapter 7? Verse 2. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was in the Ulai canal. This is about 200 miles away from the city of Babylon. In less than 30 years, the city would become the epicenter of the Persian Empire after they kind of destroyed Babylon. The reason this location matters is because Daniel is brought in a vision to this place outside of Babylon near a future superpower. Verse 3, I raised my eyes and I saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. The ram is a symbol of the Persian Empire, and the 2 horns, a symbol of the kings. One, the Medes, and the second one, the Persians. Verse 4, I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him. And there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. It showed clear dominance on the land. Verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat represents the Greek Empire, and it is moving so fast, it's advancing so fast that it's as if it is flying across the land. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. I mean, this horn is so large, it is so obvious that a blind person couldn't miss it. Verse 6, he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. And he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. The Greek Empire swept through the land, and utterly destroyed the Medes and the Persians. Verse 8. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Verse 9. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. That's a reference to Israel. It grew great even to the hosts of heaven. And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. The Greek Empire, it conquers all of the known lands, and then it kind of looks around and goes, what else can I conquer? And so it looks heavenward and decides to kind of make war there. Host, it translates as armies, and stars oftentimes is a symbol for angels. So what we have here is a symbol of the heavenly army of angels. It became great, even as great as the prince of the hosts. And the regular burnt offerings was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. He became so great that he challenges the mightiest of the mighty, the lead angel over the armies of heaven. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression. And it will throw the truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. This great one, he tramples over the center of worship and God's truth, over worship and God's truth. And surprisingly, he's successful. And watching this scene, it would make your stomach turn. It would make you very uncomfortable. It would make you feel like you're on the losing team. Verse 13. Then I heard a holy one, right? Daniel is overhearing a conversation with angels. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offerings and the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? Here's the picture. You have 2 animals that represents 2 world powers. They are playing a sort of king of the hill, exerting their dominance. The goat represents Greece, and he is the clear winner of this game. He feels so great, so powerful, that he scans the horizon to figure out if there is another contender like him that he can challenge. And he looks around and beholds. He notices on the mountain God's people, right? And there he sees the heavenly army. And they look like a good opponent for him to flex his military muscles and to show heaven and earth just how strong and powerful the Greek Empire is. So he advances and he destroys 2 of their symbols of power, worship and truth. The goat is proud, he is arrogant, and he is flaunting his arrogance. And from all the outward signs, he is. I mean, he even conquered heaven itself. This is the picture of God's people losing in the 3rd quarter with 0 hope of a comeback. They are on the losing side of the game. Verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. For Daniel, he understands this means something big. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the bank of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Just a small point of correction. Nearly every time angel is mentioned in the Bible, it describes them looking like people. Right? The writer of Hebrews tells us that some people have showed hospitality to angels without even knowing they're angels. Angels are not described as having wings or a halo over their head. Seraphim and cherubim, which are a different class of heavenly beings, they're described as having wings, but not angels. So I know. So we're going to have to, this Christmas, make some modifications to our nativity set. You're welcome. Verse 17. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the end, for the time of the end. The irony is that Daniel is, he's given an interpretation, but he still doesn't understand, even when it's explained to him. Verse 18, and when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and he made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. I know there's going to be some of you who will disagree with me on this. But from everything that I have read and researched on this passage, the end here does not mean the end of the world as we know it, but the end of the persecution that's talked about here. This to me seems to fit the context the best. Continuing in verse 20. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of the Medes and the Persians. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. These details are just scary, accurate, unbelievable how like on point these are. Like even with the written records outside of the Bible, they're like right there on point. I mean, they're so accurate that many scholars will look at these words and they will say that these must be a writer looking back upon history, writing it down. That's how spot on this is. The first king of Greece was a man by the name of Alexander the Great. Alexander took the throne around the old age of 20 years old. And in a matter of 11 to 12 years, he managed to conquer the known world. He made the world pretty much a Greek culture, with the dominant language being the Greek language. I mean, he was so fast that it was as if he was flying across the land. But he ended up dying, but he left no heirs to the throne. So his kingdom, it gets divided between 4 generals. Interestingly, there's 4 horns mentioned. And these 4 horns are the 4 kings who grow up after he had been broken off, after he died. Well, one of the generals who would eventually take control of Syria would be a guy by the name of Antiochus IV. Named after his dad, who is Antiochus the Great. But this guy was so arrogant that he decided to call him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest. And he attempted to completely make this area Greek, but he had a problem. The Jewish people, they stood in his way. So what did he do? He banned all of the sacred practices of the Jewish people. He killed the high priest, and he stopped the sacrifices. He even selected a new high priest, and he brought in to the most sacred place for the Jewish people, the temple. He brought in a pig, the most unholy animal to the Jews, and he sacrificed it on their altar to the god Zeus. The temple for the Jewish people was more than a building. It was more than where worship happened. It was the symbol of where God's presence was on earth. And the action against the temple is seen from the Jewish people as Antiochus making war with heaven itself. Not only that, but he took the Bible. This is awful. He took the Bible, he ripped pages out of it, and he burned them. And he ordered that anybody who worships God or has a Bible, the Torah, is to be put to death. In the Bible, when God's people are persecuted, God is described as taking that very personally. So personally that he sees it as an assault on him, an assault on heaven itself. And several hundred years before that, any of that takes place, Daniel is foretelling this with precision. And it's absolutely incredible. Why is it incredible? Because it tells us the God who knows the future runs the future. And the future is not favorable for an arrogant king like Antiochus Epiphanes. He is not taking home the trophy. Here's how Daniel goes on to explain this in verse 23. And the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgression have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. This is not your typical encouraging message that you would like to receive, right? And I think we could be sympathetic to Daniel laying in bed sick for days. I mean, it's not a pleasant picture. So what could possibly be encouraging about hearing the message, hey, you think life's bad right now? It's going to get a whole lot worse. Well, it's the simple fact that God knows the future and he is ruling the future just as he did the past, just as he does the present. And he has predicted the third quarter trampling. He predicted it so that when God's people would face it, they would understand that God, even in this situation, is in control. But it's not just about God's foreknowledge that's encouraging. It's also what God promises to do. We pick up the story in verse 25. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. And in his own mind, he shall become great. Without warning, he shall destroy many. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes. What is the result of him challenging the prince of princes? And he shall be broken, but not by human hand. And the vision of the evening and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. The comfort from these words is that the prideful, the beasts of kings and kingdoms who trample over God's people, they do not last even if it feels like they do. The mention of the 2,300 days is a reminder of the limited persecution. It is not giving us a chronology for us to predict, but it is showing us that the period of persecution is brief. It has an end date. And things don't end well for the proud. The future does not favor the prideful and the arrogant. And contrary to the future, it favors the humble, not the proud. It favors the beaten down, the persecuted. The humbling of God's people results in God lifting up his people. The future is not predictable from the world's point of view, and that's why we need God to kind of pull back the veil so that we can understand that he rules it. The future is a reversal where the proud are humbled and the humbled are elevated. Jesus said it best in Matthew chapter 5. He says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The future in Daniel is what life for followers of Jesus looks like. I mean, we walk around earth humbly, knowing that in God's kingdom, he reverses the way in which the world sees things getting done. Right? He says this. Jesus said this in Matthew 19. "But many who are first will be last, and the last first." Jesus wants us as his followers to know that whatever part of history we find ourselves in, whether that's the 6th century, whether BC, whether that's the 2nd century BC, whether that's the 1st century, or whether that's the 21st century, our response to the world must always be the same. Because of the God who leads us today, he rules tomorrow. And he has changed the rules of the game that we are playing. For while the kingdom of the world seeks dominance and it pushes down its threats, we are reminded that that is exactly how the cruelest of beasts standing behind the kingdoms of this world that he tried to win, but it ended in his defeat. On the cross, our greatest enemy, Satan, who is called the ruler of the kingdoms of earth, thought that by simply killing the Son of God, he would finally defeat heaven. He would defeat heavenly armies. He would beat God himself. But on the cross, when Jesus died, he did not realize that all of human sin that kept people enslaved to his rule were transferred to Jesus. And as a result, the prison gates were kicked open wide so that we can be free. Because Jesus was not just dying, he was sacrificing his life in our place, thereby taking the legal consequence on us that made us subject to Satan's rule, and we can walk out of that prison free men and free women. And Jesus tells us that when that is the way that we win. That is the way that the kingdom of God tramples over the kingdom of darkness. It was the same for Jesus. It's the same for us. It's a life of humility. And right before Jesus was going to go and take his rightful spot on the throne, his disciples surrounded him, and they're wanting to know exactly, Jesus, when is the future going to come? When are you going to restore everything? You remember what he said? Remember what he told them? He said, the game's not over. It's the end of the third quarter. You're entering the fourth quarter. It's not time to plan the party yet, and it's time for you to trust me. I'm not surprised at the point deficit on the scoreboard. I know how this game ends, okay? It's time for you to suit up and trust me and to get out there and to finish the fourth quarter well. I love how Eddie Loan put it this week. He said, God's favorite part of my story is the part where I trust him. Don't lose hope. Don't lose steam. Don't feel defeated, because we know that God rules tomorrow. And though one who we could open the paper and we can find 1.5 million reasons to be convinced that defeat is on our horizon, we have the book that tells us what the future looks like, and it is victory on the horizon, not defeat. It's the fourth quarter. It is the finest hour. It is the comeback. It may not be the way that you imagined it, but it certainly hasn't caught God off guard. He saw the trials. He saw the challenges. He saw what was coming your way. And he has reminded us that he is the one in charge of the future. He is the one who is leading. He is the one who is ruling the future. So what does Daniel do after he hears of God's defeat of these evil kings and the hope of restoring? Verse 27. And I, Daniel, was overcome, and I lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went to the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. He grabbed his helmet, he put on his cleats, and he ran onto the field. And he did what he was called to do. Church, God has given us a mission. He has given us the mission to go and to make disciples of all nations. Don't be discouraged by the points on the scoreboard as they are right now. Don't be discouraged of the circumstances that you may be facing. Because history tells us that the future tells a different story. Take heart, grab hold of the hope we have, and move forward with the mission that God has given us. Because the God who rules today is the God who rules tomorrow. And this God is holding us, he's holding you in his hands. And no matter how bleak, no matter how hopeless life may feel like for you right now, when we put our trust in him, we know how the game ends. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you so much for your love, for your grace, for your kindness. God, I thank you that for us, our victory, our hope is not rooted in the circumstances we face. They're rooted in you and what you did on the cross for us. Father, I pray for everybody who'd listen to this message maybe being a difficult season, I just ask that you would pour into their hearts a great sense of encouragement, Father, that you would renew their faith, renew their trust in you. And Father, we ask that we would live in such a way that we would have such a confidence in the face of discouragement, that the people would look at us and know that we are on the winning team, that we belong to you. And Jesus, we love you, we thank you, and we pray all of this in your name. Amen. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so glad that you were able to tune in with us online. Hey, I want to just say, if the message is encouraging to you, could you do us a favor and just share this message with somebody that you know, Facebook, social media, wherever. We would love to connect with you to hear how you're doing, how we can pray for you, and if there's any spiritual decisions that you are in the process of making. We have a digital bulletin that you can scan, or you can just simply go to the website and you'll be able to find it there. We love to connect, see how we can pray for you, help you out in any way. Also, on our church website, there's a giving tab that you can continue to give to the church. You can also mail in a check, set up auto payment with your bank, or even stop by the church yourself. We give because ultimately it is an act of worship. We give because Christ gave his life for us, and it's just simply what we do in response. Hey, I want to let you know that this coming Wednesday we have kind of a surprise episode. I'm keeping people in suspense as to what it's going to be or who it's going to be. There's a couple of different options, but you'll just have to wait to find out. Church, we love you, we're praying for you, and we cannot wait to see you soon. God bless.